Welcome to this webinar series. The series is titled Post-Philosophies and the Doing of Inquiry. This is the fifth in the series so far, and we have enjoyed hearing from a range of scholars over the past few months. This webinar is a free webinar series. It's year-long. We meet on Zoom monthly on the topic of post-qualitative inquiry, or perhaps the doing of inquiry inspired by a range of post-philosophies. Each session involves one or two international guests who have experience with inquiry approaches inspired by many philosophies such as post-humanism, post-structuralism, affect theories, feminist new materialism, post-colonialism, decolonialism, just to name a few. So I'm Candace Kuby, and I am co-hosting this with Viv Bozalek, and we hope that she'll be able to join us here shortly for the webinar today. The series is made possible by a collaborative partnership between the University of Missouri System and the University of the Western Cape, or UWC, in Cape Town, South Africa. The partnership between our universities started way back in 1986, and funding for the webinar series is provided through the University of Missouri South African Education Program Committee, which supports academic exchanges between the University of Missouri System and UWC, and provides opportunities for teaching, learning, research, and community engagement between our two universities. We are really grateful for our university's longtime collaboration and support of this webinar series. These webinars are also available to you on YouTube. You can find them, you can find out how to get to our YouTube channel from the webinar website. You can also subscribe to the series, so each time one is posted, you'll get a notification about that. Also, we want to make sure people are aware that YouTube has an option to select for closed captioning, so you can see the written transcript of the webinar on the video. Also, we are excited to share that the webinar series will become 2 special issues in the journal Qualitative Inquiry. We are so thrilled that the editors reached out and asked if we'd be interested, myself and Viv, in editing a special issue. And since there are so many webinars, it will take up 2 issues of the journal. So stay tuned for more information. I know some people had reached out to us and asked for transcripts, or can we get some kind of written copy of each of the webinars? So we think that by having journal articles available in the future, that will be a space for people to go back and read what the panelists have shared during the webinars. We have updated our website too with the exact times for each webinar. We found out our mistake with daylight savings time in the US was a little bit of a trick last month. And so please look next to each panelist's name for the exact time for the webinars as we unfold in the months to come. So Erin, I just want to pause. Oh, I think I see Viv maybe there. Do you see her? Let me go ahead and let her in. I see her that she's joined us now. And if you can make sure she's a co-host, Erin, once she gets in, so her video can be turned on.
Unfortunately, I'm still not seeing her.
Oh, okay. Let me see if I can get her. Let's see if we can get her here in just a moment. So we want to introduce our panelists today, Dr. Kakali Bhattacharya. And please help me out if I'm not saying that right. I want to make sure that I pronounce it the way that you'd prefer. Do you mind introducing yourself there?
Yeah, so it's Kakali Bhattacharya if you want to do it the Anglo way. If you want to do it the culturally native way, it's Bhattacharya.
Thank you. So we are excited to have you here, Kakali. You are a professor at the University of Florida and housed in the Research, Evaluation, and Measurement program. So welcome. Thank you for making time to join us today.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having us, or having me rather.
So I'm going to introduce Erin Price. She is a PhD student here at the University of Missouri with me, and those who have been joining our webinar know that she has made the beautiful artwork, which you all were talking about before we officially started the webinar today. She is an artist, and she is an art educator with experiences coordinating preschool through secondary art education in U.S. public schools, as well as community-based art explorations at home and abroad. Erin is very interested in intersections of art and inquiry, including the role of material invitations, affect, and artistic encounters, and the becomings of identity and community. And so we're excited that Erin is able to help us throughout this webinar series with the technical support on the platform today, also with the videos and the YouTube channel, and also moderating the Q&A portion of the webinar today. So thanks, Erin, for all your support and help, and for the beautiful artwork that you made possible for the webinar series.
Thank you. It's been so wonderful to just have a hand in this amazing series. So I have the honor to introduce today our two co-hosts, and I believe that Viv is with us now. Vivienne Bozalek is an emerita professor in women's and gender studies at the University of the Western Cape, South Africa. She's also an honorary professor in the Center for Higher Education Research, Teaching and Learning at Rhodes University. And she holds a PhD from Utrecht University. Her research interests and publications include political ethics of care and social justice, post-humanism and feminist new materialisms, and innovative pedagogical practices in higher education, post-qual and participatory methodologies. Her most recent co-edited books include Socially Just Pedagogies, Post-Humanist, Feminist, and Materialist Perspectives in Higher Education, and Post-Anthropocentric Social Work, Critical Post-Human and New Materialist Perspectives. Dr. Candace Kuby is an Associate Professor of Learning, Teaching, and Curriculum at the University of Missouri, Department Chair and Director of Qualitative Inquiry. Her research interests are the coming to be of literacies when young children work with artistic and digital tools, and approaches and pedagogies of qualitative inquiry when thinking with post-structural and post-humanist philosophies. She is the co-author of several books, including Speculative Pedagogies and Qualitative Inquiry, Post-Humanism and Literacy Education, Knowing, Becoming, Doing Literacies. And her scholarship appears in journals including Qualitative Inquiry, Journal of Early Childhood Literacy, Journal of Literacy Research, and Cultural Studies and Critical Methodologies. We are so thankful for your work putting this series together, and we look forward to what it's producing.
Hi,
Welcome,
everyone.
Viv.
Sorry
Hi,
I
Viv.
joined late. Thank you. Thank you. Hi. Just a hi from me, and then a little bit of an overview of the Zoom platform that we're using. You might have noticed that we're using the webinar platform instead of the meeting platform to show to allow a larger number of people to attend this session. So only the hosts and the panelists have the video and audio functions. And as we mentioned, we are recording this webinar for public viewing later on YouTube. The chat function is open for you to connect with other attendees during the webinar, and we see some of you have already been chatting. But if you want to ask questions, we ask that you do use the Q&A button. That button is located at the bottom of your screen on the right-hand side. So that will make it easier for us to moderate the questions so that we're not scrolling between the chat and the Q&A function. So please do try and locate that on your screen if you don't already know where it is. This is the way the webinar will be structured. For the first 30 or 40 minutes, Candace will interview Kakali on 4 main questions, which is our common thread for all the webinars in this series. And you can find them also on our webpage. While discussing these questions, she might also share some examples from her scholarship and the suggested readings. I hope you've all had a chance to read Kakali's very interesting readings that we have on our website. Then Candace will spend some time talking with Kakali on how she mentors and teaches graduate students while they engage in post-philosophies and the doing of inquiry. We want this webinar series to open spaces for conversations that often aren't discussed publicly on how to navigate the academy in the doing of inquiry. So we then will open the space for questions from attendees to Kakali, and we hope to have about 30 minutes for this. So we invite you throughout the webinar to jot down your questions as you think of them, and then we'll come to that in the Q&A session. We're going to, as I said, moderate the questions through the Q&A function of Zoom, not through the chat, and get through as many as we can. So please feel free to go ahead and write down questions during the session. I'm going to hand over to Candace now.
Thanks so much, Viv. Thanks for helping us to kind of understand the way we'll moderate questions and for people to connect throughout the whole webinar through the chat function. So we wanted to do a little bit of a more in-depth introduction and then jump right into the questions that we're asking all of our panelists throughout the webinar series. I see also that you helped us to make sure we're pronouncing your name correctly in the chat. So thank you for putting that there for us. So Kakali.
It's Kakali, actually.
Kakali.
Yes.
There we go.
Kakali.
Thank you so much. As we said before, she's a professor at the University of Florida, housed in the Research Evaluation and Measurement Program. Her work has made spaces in interdisciplinary decolonizing work and qualitative research, where creativity and contemplative approaches are legitimized and seen as gateways for cultivating depth, integrity, expansive inquiry, and discovering critical insights. She explores transnational issues of race, class, and gender in higher education. She is also the 2018 winner of AERA's Mid-Career Scholar of Color Award and the 2018 winner of AERA's Mentoring Award from Division G, Social Context of Education. Her co-authored text with Kent Gillen titled Power, Race, and Higher Education, a Cross-Cultural Parallel Narrative, has won a 2017 Outstanding Publication Award from AERA and a 2018 Outstanding Book Award from the International Congress of Qualitative Research. She is also the 2020 winner of the Mary Frances Early College of Education Distinguished Alumni Award for Research from the University of Georgia, which I think is your alma mater. So congratulations on all of those awards. And again, we are just so grateful that you're joining us today to share your perspectives and help all of those who are either with us today or who are going to watch the webinar in the future to understand the ways that you think about the doing of inquiry. I've personally been looking forward to the conversation for a while. I've read your scholarship over time and I've heard you present at some conferences. And then I re-entered the scholarship when you sent us these 3 suggested readings that are on the website. I marked them up and have lots of questions that we may or may not get to today, but I know we'll have a generative conversation that will provoke thought for us and all of our attendees. So let's jump in. As we said before, we have 4 questions that we're asking all of our panelists throughout the series. And the first question that we're asking is, how does your philosophical approach influence your ways of doing inquiry?
Well, first, thank you for having me. I said that before, but I want to definitely make sure that you know I'm really grateful and honored to be on a panel with folks that I went to graduate school with, who are my mentors, whose classes I took. I took Betty's class, the postmodernism class in qualitative research in 2004. And that was when she was thinking about post-qual. Betty and Patty were, writing that paradigm chart out to the last column of it. And I've sort of had a front row seat to that. So to be now in dialogue with that work and my own work is just such a surreal moment. So I just want to say that I'm really grateful for the space making that you are doing for my work as well, along with all the other work. And I want to also thank the attendees. I know they're coming in from various parts of the world. So thank you for everyone who thought this would be something you would like to attend. I'm humbled by the number that I see in the bottom of my screen, that many people at that many time zones are over here today. So welcome everyone. So now to talk about the question that you're asking me, how does my philosophical approach influence my ways of doing inquiry? I do need to do a little bit of tracing of my own history to be able to respond to that. So I was born in India and I moved to Canada in my early teenage years and then to the US to do graduate school work. And I was moving through a career of going into medical school, which is on brand for my cultural group. And so I was mostly in the sciences. So I took all sorts of science classes. I was really good at math. I find math to be amazingly therapeutic because it has closure at the end. When I come up with an answer, I come up with an answer. I don't have to be open-ended and ambiguous and fluid and ask more questions out of it. I could ask more questions if I went into deeper math and theoretical math, but the math that I was doing in high school and then in university didn't require that. So it had a finite ending, finite conclusions. It's kind of nice, it reinforces that you are a good student, all of those things. So I was doing that. And then eventually I ended up meandering through my undergrad and getting a Bachelor of Science degree in psychology. And then I didn't know what to do for a while, and I had accidentally run into a master's program in US because I was visiting my mother, and then I did a program in CNI doing instructional design, and moved through my PhD program from being in instructional technology to qualitative research. um, and part of the reason why that happened was I was in a class with one of my mentors, and I had read Ruth Behar's Vulnerable Observer, and then she had another a book she wrote from her ethnography called Translated Woman. And I was reading about this story about this Mexican peddler, Esperanza, and she had this very difficult life, and I didn't have that difficult of a life that she did. She had been living on the streets and had miscarriages and had all sorts of patriarchal nonsense to deal with, and it was just in bearing witness to another fellow human being's life that things shifted for me, like in profound ways, through a sense of interconnectivity, but also a sense of like understanding positionality, like where am I located in these moments when a fellow human being is going through these other moments, and and it was just so profound that I wondered, like, how is this even research, like, because I had all this positivist training. So I was the student in class that challenged my professors and asked, how is this valid, how is this reliable, how is this generalizable? I was the one. And thank God that I was the one, because now when my students ask me those same questions, I'm like, I get you, I see a little bit of me in you, it's all right, it's all good, I can take it, bring it on. So that, when it just shifted me so much, I wondered, like, could research be something that's not sterile and something that moves people such deeply? And by research, I'm lumping both inquiry and research. I know people define it in different ways. So for me, it was more like an inquiry, like, is knowledge making something that shifts you this way, and can that be considered something worth doing? And then I wanted to just follow that, because what if I could write something and then it shifts people's thinking about something in a certain way? And this is not to imply that quantitative work doesn't shift thinking either. That can too. It's just that I wasn't inspired by reading anything up until that point in quantitative research as I was with that. So with that, I ended up doing just about taking everything University of Georgia offered, whether it be theory classes, methodological classes. Sometimes just have all of them. If they're offering, I'm taking. I was just very hungry for it. What I also learned post university in my first job at the University of Memphis is that University of Georgia is an utopia for qual. You want to do whatever qual you want to do, you can do it. You want to do arts-based qual, go for it. You want to do traditional qual, go for it. You want to do qual with no methodologies, go for it. You want to do theoretical stuff, go for it. I mean, but the world is not like that. That was a rude awakening when I walked out of there, and I thought that people have some working knowledge or familiarity with qual at some level, and then I'm in different spaces where that wasn't to be the case. They barely got traditional qual, let alone anything beyond traditional. And qual was very much synonymous with coding, and just to get people to think beyond that was just not something that was even possible, because we were still thinking of verifiability, triangulation, and all of these other concepts to just make space for qual first, let alone these other things. And so that created a different landscape for me to be professional qualitative methodologist versus the landscape from where I got trained, you know, and to not have a lot of colleagues who I can count on, who can build this culture with me, made it really difficult to figure out, like, how do I situate this work and open it up for students to be expansive with it, while helping them advocate for that work with committee members, dissertation committee members, who may or may not see this even worthy, like who may already see it unworthy for something as simple as sample size, you know? So, and then because Memphis was primarily a Black city with 60% of the population being Black, and I've written about this in my publications, that's where, you know, I got a pause one day when a student asked, like, well, the white man still signs our paycheck. What's your Deleuze and Derrida going to do if, you know, if things are still always the same around here? And, you know, I could have a theoretical response to that, and I had one, but I understood the response came from a place of pain, and then the response came from a place of lack of cultural responsiveness with what I was teaching. Because Derrida or Deleuze didn't think about Black folks when they wrote their stuff, you know, and Deleuze wasn't the first one to challenge dogma. You know, there were plenty of people before Deleuze who challenged dogma. So I realized I was teaching the way I have been taught, and I was fine with how I've been taught. I had a critical lens, I had a decolonial lens, but I didn't interrogate authors and their positionality. There was a sense of universality that was communicated through philosophy that I didn't interrogate. I took philosophy, I didn't interrogate the historical, cultural, political nature of philosophy, you know, and I just did it. I just did the work. And so that started a journey of unlearning, you know, like how do we take a field such as philosophy and expand it? How do we understand that, you know, the start of Western civilization isn't the start of philosophical discourses, you know? Things existed before Descartes and Aristotle, you know, so that created this unlearning, which I didn't know which journey I was going. So I stopped, you know, publishing empirical pieces at that point because I didn't know how to look at them anymore. I'm like, I gotta unlearn stuff, you know, which is problematic because my employer, my department chair, was not giving me good annual evaluations because publication was slow. Because I'm like kind of in a place where I'm like, what do I need to unlearn? All of it, some of it, none of it, you know? So at that point, my quant colleagues are publishing 5 to 7 pieces a year and getting exceeds expectation. And I'm like, one, maybe two, you know? And so that was hard. That has its own, you know, emotional challenges, thinking you're not good enough and imposter syndromes and all of those other things too. So at that point, I started unpacking all of this, and I started putting things in a context that felt more congruent with my way of understanding the world that I've forgotten. And so that's when I began to really dig into the work I did in my dissertation and the framing of decolonial that I did with the D/colonial. And the slash could be the postmodern stuff that I was reading from where I was picking that up, but it was then getting like informed by other things too. And so for me, that was a sense of like, no matter what we're doing, if it is a critique of something, we're always in relationship with that. So if post-humanism is in relationship with humanism, and post-colonialism is in relationship with colonialism, postmodernism is in relationship with modernism, post-structuralism is in relationship with structuralism, and in some way, inevitably, it becomes the other. You know, it becomes in an other relationship. It becomes a us versus them relationship. It becomes, and you know, the way it gets picked up is like one is better than the other. You want to be on this side versus this other side, you know. And I wanted to soften those boundaries. I wanted to soften those harsh binaries into something different. So when I did the D/colonialism, I realized that, you know, even in this resistance to colonial ways of thinking, doing inquiry, you know, I'm still in relationship with colonialism. Like, so I am still resisting. I am still trying to open up this new stuff. And am I just sitting in a master's house and just breaking down walls, but I'm still in the master's house, you know, just made bigger room for myself, you know? So then I thought, what would utopia look like? So utopia is this imagination of a future where I'm no longer in relationship with any of this, you know, I'm just free, we're just free. All of us are free. And so that became like a memories of the future sort of thinking, like I'm thinking about and dreaming about this future. And I started thinking about it as memories of the future and then living in the present moment. So there is this shuttling going on back and forth. So that became the framing that I did. And it took me a good 15 years, after which I came up with my own theoretical framework that was much more culturally situated than where when I first started. Because when I first started, I did my dissertation with a decolonial onto epistemology, but then I needed other theoretical frameworks to really get to closer analysis of the work that I was doing. So I had transnationalism, transnational feminism, post-colonialism, and it just was too much. It was like everything had to be fed through all of these lenses, and it's not an easy application. It's not like, oh, this part is definitely transnationalism, this part is definitely post-colonialism. It's all entangled in its own mess, and it just was a permanent headache forever. So I wanted something that was much more culturally grounded, and I was reading Linda Tuhiwai-Smith's work in Decolonizing Methodologies, and I just admired how bold and fierce that work was and how rigorous the work was too. And then I was reading a lot of Gloria Anzaldua's work, not just the Borderlands work, but even after Borderlands work. And it just was really inspiring to see people do that work from a place of, location, and not present things as ahistorical, acultural, apolitical, or not get picked up as ahistorical, acultural, apolitical. And so that's sort of how I have been thinking about doing inquiry, to not make inquiry this universal thing, to not make philosophy this universal thing. I mean, even if you look at American discourses, North American and especially US discourses around philosophies, you'll see, and this is in my post-qual rejecting post-qual paper, that there has been tremendous amount of patriarchal nonsense in the discipline of philosophy. You try to think of like some very powerful just women philosophers in US, it's hard to start naming some of them. It's much more prevalently male dominated field. It has serious amount of documentation of sexual harassment and people leaving the fields and all sorts of things. And so I don't want to just glorify a field and say like, this is what we benchmark everything we do in inquiry to. I want to make sure that I'm problematizing it and locating it and positioning myself in dialogue with it to see where do I line up and where do I don't, where do I just go another way with it. And so that's kind of my philosophical orientation to inquiry.
Well, that was a lot. And I just loved how you backed us up and really took us back to kind of, you said, this 15-year journey of unlearning. And in the suggested readings, I had made some notes and thought about what stuck with me after I read the pieces. And you mentioned some of this as well, but you start with, I think, two of the pieces, you talk about the story from your advisor about why don't you read your people, and how that question produced a lot of, I would say, generativity for you over years, it seems like. And then also you shared a little bit too about when you were teaching in Memphis and how 60 of the people there are Black. And you talked a little bit about how this question from a student, provoked you for years as well. And I just love how these small moments, these small questions are really big questions.
Very.
Yes, very big. So I really appreciated your intentionality as a writer, and even your endnotes where you talk about language, like you were talking about using the slash and decolonizing, and why, and how that attaches to your philosophical kind of unlearnings and understandings over time. You mentioned here this notion of softening boundaries, which I would love to think more about, but I just appreciate the vulnerability in your writing and the transparency through stories and the stories that you tell. Over the past 15 years, especially. I also noticed when I was reading them, and you've mentioned a little bit, but maybe you'll talk a little bit more here, is I noticed, you mentioned just now a lot of the people whose work has been influential for you. And you talked about Anna Louise Keating, which is not somebody that I knew of. And there were several quotes in there, and I would love to find this book and read it that you referenced, but there is a phrase around post-oppositionality. And
Yeah.
you talk a little bit too about critical research or justice research, and talk about binaries in some sense and what's happening perhaps in the broader world, but also in the academy. Do you mind talking maybe just a little bit more about that kind of orientation and where that's taking you right now and your understandings of inquiry?
Yeah, so I've used post-oppositionality as a way to find pathways out of some of the corrosive discussions in academia. So in academia, academia is set up to be oppositional. Like it incentivizes opposition. Like this whole sense of like literature review is Western imperialistic oppositional thinking that until I came along, none of these other people could figure out the gap. I am the gap finder, magical unicorn, And I think it's so freaking arrogant. It's absolutely arrogant to say that nobody else figured it out and I'm the one and now I'm going to do this work and now everybody's going to be enlightened because I did this work. You think about book proposals and everything, and it sets you up in opposition with your colleagues. How is your work different? What is your work going to bring in? And I continuously resist those sorts of discussions because it gets so corrosive. We have to set things up against each other, people who code versus people who don't code. Why do we have to do that? Why? Because not all work requires coding, but some work could. And if it does, then we can respect that work as not our thing, not our jam, but those that need to do it could do it in a way that could be rigorous, because not everybody has the disciplinary privilege to expand themselves out into deep philosophical spaces. Like it takes time to expand boundaries that are set on different disciplines. So I was having front row seat to a lot of this sort of corrosive conversations, and it was between folks that I liked and loved and admired that were in different academic camps, and it was really, really like just painful. It just was very painful to watch this sort of oppositional dialogues. And then when Anna Louise Keating's work came out in Transformation Now, and she leaned a lot on Zildua's work because they were writing partners together. So she leaned a lot on her. And that's when I was like, finally, somebody talks about the corrosiveness of this work, and it's also, it also bears the same critique I have with like posthumanism is a critique of humanism, and postmodernism is a critique of modernism, and then inherently it's set up in oppositional conversations. So you could say post-oppositionalism is critique of oppositionalism, and inherently it's so it's a tricky slope. So Anna Louise tries to like really go and explain that, to say, I'm not saying you can't do that work, do it if you want to, but I'm just saying, can we push the boundaries a little bit? Can we soften it? Can we prod it? Can we see what's out there beyond this? Can we do that? And that became very, very synchronous with what I was thinking about Audre Lorde's master's tools cannot break the master's house. So that's when I was like, are we just breaking rooms around the master's house, and we could just go outside and build our own damn houses, with our own tools. And so that was sort of like, I just didn't want to be in a conversation with the dominant narrative to just for what goal, so that the oppressor becomes a benevolent dictator. Like why am I centering the oppressor, or why am I centering a dominant discourse and trying to get buy-in from the margin to the dominant discourse? Why can't I just build what I want to build from wherever I'm at? And so then I began to not be in that dialogue anymore, not be in that oppositional conversation, and can understand that certain work has certain appeal to some people and it just doesn't. I mean, it just really came down to is everything is not for everybody. And I can be at peace with that. And if somebody is not resonating with my work, I can be at peace with that. But I really felt compelled to do the work that, came through to my own sense of integrity. And it never felt right to just, line up with what academia incentivizes us to do. And often it's like working in silos and showing how you're doing better than somebody else, and we pit each other against each other, and I just wanted to reimagine higher education differently. And I didn't want the next generation of academics to think that this is normal, this is good, this is how you become a scholar. I wanted it to be like, you can become a scholar and you can have differences of dialogues with folks, and you can still be generous and compassionate with them. Because if we're talking about interconnectivity with all things, it can't be between just humans and objects like rock, paper, scissors. We have to think about interconnectivity with each other and the relational ethics we bring to the table with our colleagues and scholars, even if their work is different from ours, and even if we philosophically locate completely differently. It's still a fellow human being's blood, sweat, and tears, their efforts, their labors, their resistance against their field to make that little space, whatever the space they're making, resistance against dissertation committees, tenure and promotion committees, so just having sat in like different grant committees where, forget like theoretical anything qual, they can barely like make space for some of the qual stuff. And I've sat on like different grant committees, federal and foundation grants, and it's disappointing to see like who gets to sit around and what gets to be normalized as research, and to then say, I want to push for this. If I want to push my own brand of work, there's going to be no space making for that, none whatsoever, because they're not there yet. They don't have the readiness for that. But I think that, if we support a colleague's work that essentially opens up some space that wasn't there before, even if it's not the work I would do, I could support that. I could support that, and I could put some of my scholarly weight behind that to help justify that. So I began to blur those boundaries. I could be in opposition to certain types of qual work, but I don't have to tear them down as a result of it, So that was sort of coming up for me. So I started thinking oppositionally, and then Ansel Dua and Ana Luis talks about it too, of this concept of Nepantlara, So this is the person who's continuously in these middle spaces, in these in between liminal spaces, and moving in and out of these different worlds without being indoctrinated by any so far that they can't see other worlds and other worldviews. So I became this sort of methodological polyglot, this threshold traveler. I go over the threshold, but I don't go so deep that I don't know that any other world exists other than the one that I went into. And so that allowed me to develop connections and develop historicities, and also inspired me to look at my own historicity. So I've been going back to my cultural texts that I didn't have access to, and then start thinking ontologically, epistemologically, ethically through those cultural texts. How do I bring meaning to it? And so as a result of doing that, I ended up going and looking at some nonsense literature from my my cultural background. And so this author effortlessly created these sorts of like narratives and dreams where like animals, objects, everybody talked. We didn't have very obscure language for it. It was just a way of being, there was just, we knew it, we understood it growing up, we laughed, there was whimsy. And that's when I realized, like, when we read it as a child, it was just whimsy. When I read it as an adult, I see it as metaphors and imagery and critique. And I'm like, this is brilliant. This is so brilliant. And why haven't I thought this way? Because I haven't been introduced to these works that way. Academia didn't introduce me. Academia didn't make space for me to even go there. What got standardized was a very traditional Western academic practice. And I would say even in India, I wouldn't have been introduced to it because we were once colonized nation. So we privilege Western ways of knowing as well, so that really made me think about, how do I bring these ideas together that can be in tension with each other, but they do coexist. These tensions coexist in the world. So why can't they coexist in my work?
So that really is a nice segue into our second question. And I hear hints of it coming through
Yes.
already. So our second question is really about, what do these philosophical approaches make possible or thinkable for you doing inquiry? And so a couple of things I've heard that I might just put back out again is, you talked a while ago about how some people see research and inquiry as maybe different in some ways. So you might want to pick that up some more. But also in your nonsense playing article that the children's book that you just were starting to talk about a little bit, I think it was from 1921, published in India. So you might share a little bit more about that story and in that reading that you shared as a suggested reading, and about this notion of nonsensical nature and how that provoked your thoughts on the doing of inquiry. I think that there was a great quote here that I'll read from the article that you wrote as well. And so you're talking about the book and what it's provoked for you around inquiry. And you say, for me, inquiry involves tracing lines of flight while striving to abandon meaning wherever possible. And then you're saying that that might be counterintuitive in some way, that inquiry requires surrendering the will to know. And so then you go on to say, I began to trace the consequences of playfully abandoning meaning and sense making in favor of absurdity, whimsy, and flight. Such actions provide me with wisdom, capacity, and sustenance I need to return to navigating and negotiating colonizing forces. So talk to us a little bit about maybe how this particular children's book or other philosophical pieces that you have gone back to find, and how that shapes maybe data production for you. Or you talked a little bit about questioning literature reviews. And so kind of some of these more traditional ideas of what counts as doing inquiry and how you're thinking about that now.
Yeah. So the children's book that I read was from an author called Sukumar Rai. He came from a family of literary geniuses, you know, and they, during India's colonized history, they had their own printing press. So that, and they were a very privileged group of people, and they had their own printing press, and they were printing these children's magazines, children's books and stuff, and this was embedded in there. And they made up nonsensical words, like absolutely didn't have any words. They created hybrid animals, you know, Sukumar Rai created hybrid animals, but his father did too. You know, they created these hybrid animals, and then, you know, then they gave them like certain characteristics, you know. So there was this one poem that he wrote about this snake charmer walking through a village, and the villagers wanting to have a couple of snakes, but they want to make sure those snakes are, you know, defanged and doesn't shoot out poison and doesn't bite and doesn't do too much, and just, you know, maybe just sleeps all day and just eats a little bit of food, and then so that one day they could come and beat them with a stick and kill them. And so, like, when growing up, you know, I read it and I thought, that's kind of funny, snake killing. And now I look at it and I've, you know, referenced other things too. And it really showed, you know, a critique of colonialism and a critique of proxy colonizers, you know, and that being in proximity to the colonizer just still didn't, you know, allow them freedom, because the colonizer would try to render them, you know, defenseless first, and then still come at them anyway. And then you look at that pattern through the world, and you'll see that that's true in many justice movements. You look at like Black Lives Matter movement, you render all sorts of scarcity for Black folks and over incarcerate and legislate and all of these, and then you go blame them for any type of, you know, resistance that they're having, and you sort of discipline them for protesting, discipline them for all sorts of things, you know. And so for me, like, when I started looking into, like, let's stop sense making and let's look at how absurd some things actually are. So it's absurd to think this level of local, national, international, you know, systems of oppression is normal to experience every day. It's absolutely absurd, you know. So then you think about court jesters, and they were these astute observers who would take things to the absurdity, but have those elements of truth in there that make you think about some things a little differently, because they defang the realism of it, you know. So when you defang the realism of it, and maybe it's a little humorous, maybe it's a little witty, people can maybe look at it again that they couldn't, because the charge was too high to look at it when it was too real. So if you make it really absurd, and comedians do this effortlessly, you know, so you make it too absurd, then people will be like, oh, well, it's not me. Their first round is, oh, well, it's not me. and then they sit with it and they're like, oh, well, it has elements of me in it. Then it could be like, oh, well, if it has elements of me in it, do I go on as I did, or do I do something differently? So it was becoming necessary. Like, meaning comes out anyway, but I just was trying to like abandon the need for it, abandon the need for like a will to know. And I said that this comes from my dissertation. I said that when you go into doing work, like where you are talking to people, you're not entitled to know anything, even if they sign consent forms, because signing paperwork in relation to something else has a lot of negative history and trauma for many communities in the world. Lots of bad things have happened. So just because they said that they will tell you this and they will share information about this, and you start talking to them and they're not sharing information about whatever you thought they were sharing information, you need to have a much more humbling posture than flaunting the consent form in front of their faces. But you said you will say this. You have to understand the refusal as an inquiry too, as a point of inquiry as well. So I was beginning to say that you walk in not treating participants as data repositories from whom you are just going to extract information, repurpose it, and then put it out there for the world to consume it. So you're going to have to be in a relationship with them, not just for trust and rapport, be in a genuine relationship, and be able to understand that you have to give up your will to know. Like, you just have to give up your will to know. If you want to interrogate the general premise of research being oppressive and colonizing, regardless of which research you're doing, you have to give up your will to know. And so when everything is made up, so qualitative research is made up, so is quantitative research, so is mixed methods research, so is post-qual. When everything is made up with a shared agreement, that's all that's holding it together. How many people share those agreements? Why can't folks make up their own lines of inquiry? Why can't they take their own lines of flight? Why can't they figure out how to build these relationships that are maybe not published in books, but they know it from their cultural understandings? And so those could be paths of inquiry, those could be methodology, those could look like methodologizing. And I just think that's fine, just make it so that people would do that. And even when you abandon it, I mean, we're still sort of condemned to some way of structure and processes. Like, you look at like Laurel Richardson's writing, where she talks about writing as a form of inquiry before she co-authored another piece with Betty. She made up like different types of notes and memos you can make through writing, and she listed it. And that's a methodologizing. I can't say that word. But and then she created this creative analytic practices, and that's another structure that she put on. And thank God she put that structure on, because now that helps a lot of us who want to have an open-ended inquiry to have a little bridge to communicate with our colleagues, to say, I know you feel like this is anything goes, but I can promise you it's not anything goes. And we do have some ideas that we are benchmarking as aspirational in this work. And here's some language around it. So I think that when I think about these traditional aspects of qualitative research, first, the part that really bothers me is the positivist way we have to do proposals. It really bothers me. I freaking predict everything in advance. Well, qualitative research is not about predicting. How can I predict how I'm going to analyze my data? Seriously, why do you need me to write that part up? I can tell you about the literature I'm drawing from. I can tell you about the theory I'm drawing from. I can even tell you, maybe if I'm not doing practice-based inquiry, general scope of my inquiry. But beyond that, I can't tell you anything else. I can't fully predict out what will happen in data collection. I can't fully predict out what will happen in data analysis. I can't tell you, how I'm going to maintain trustworthiness, because beyond the sterile things that I can tell you, there's so much other thing that unfold in the doing of inquiry that I can't even predict. And even if I predict, it might go another way. So if you hold me to this one thing and it goes another way, you're just creating extra labor for me to say, why did it go this other way? It's just nonsensical. It's so absurd to me for an inquiry that is process-based, emergent, that we have to have all the predictions in advance as much as we can. I mean, those are so incongruent. absolutely incongruent ways. So as much as I try to encourage folks to push back, and it just depends on people's risk tolerance in those circumstances. Some folks don't want to. Some folks are just like, listen, I'm just getting this degree and I'm going to do what I need to do. I got other problems in my life. This is not what I want to fight. And you have to respect that. If that's what they're coming from, that's their location, you respect that. And then some folks, I have a student right now, she's doing her qualifying exams as a mural. She's doing a synthesis of literature as a mural, which is way harder to do than writing it out, and she'll have a write up for it. Erin, if you want, when it's done, I'll ask her permission and send it to you if you want to take a look at it. So I try to, make space for this other way, not other way, but whatever the way is for people to do this work without being limited by previous discussions. Like if the previous discussions are helpful, great. But if they're struggling with it because it's incongruent to their work, I would be like, don't wait till 15 years like I did to make shit up. Make it up right now. Sorry for cussing. My heart is pure. But don't wait that long. Don't wait that long. Do it at the dissertation level where you get all the support from people. People are going to work with you. People are going to challenge you. People are going to help you interrogate people. Even the challengers, even your challengers at dissertation level are doing you a favor because they're preparing you for the publication world. And whatever resistance you're going to get, you got language, you got ways of thinking. So my dissertation, I felt heavily challenged. I didn't even think I did that much groundbreaking dissertation. I did ethnodrama. I had front and backstage plays, multiple. I imagined it in a figuration of a 3-dimensional front and backstage plays where I thought discourses and power relations in one space connects to discourses and power relations in another, and people move in and out of those and construct how they want to navigate certain spaces in academia and negotiate like invisible curriculum. I didn't think that was that groundbreaking because ethnodrama wasn't the thing that was so new. There was lots of press, literature about it, but it was new to the context in which I was introducing it in. And so there was a lot of questions. Why do I do this? Why am I not doing this? And sometimes it felt like unfair because I'm like, my colleagues are not getting interrogated as hard as I'm getting, and it made it difficult at that time. It made it very challenging. And then when I was done my ethnodrama, I was asked to produce themes, and it just was like, I can't produce themes. I gave you plays. The director of the play doesn't come out and say, by the way, you're supposed to take 5 things out of this play. Art needs to just stand on its own and people need to just make their own entry points to it. How do I give you themes? But I had a job lined up. I needed the degree in hand. You know what? If the system wants themes, I'll give you themes. So I ended up making each of the themes tensions. I gave you a statement, but the statement is full of tensions. And so I unpack it with nothing being stable inside of it. So I did that. Now in my old age, I also understand that there is a sort of, a lot of us are addicted to this multiplicity and ambiguity. Like we're addicted to ambiguity because it's seductive, and because it keeps us curious, and we are learners and we want to keep learning and it keeps us curious. And to some extent, I think that has value, and I'm not knocking that because I've been there and I'm still there. But in other cases, I think there is some strategic essentialism, as Spivak has said, is needed because you need movements to dismantle certain things, so we can claim some things with certainty. We don't have to defer truth so much that is so permanently deferred that we're ignoring the suffering, so patriarchy, colonialism, Islamophobia, transphobia, homophobia, ableism, there are certainties there are certain ways structures are set up that create certain oppression, and you cannot be ambiguous about it and claim that proudly, to say like, I don't stand for this, I'm in resistance to this. And that goes against that whole post-oppositionality. But certain things you have to be, if you are doing, at least where I locate myself with doing justice oriented work, if there's some clear injustices that you see, I don't think that we need to talk about it in ambiguity. You can call that out for the dehumanizing nature of it. If you don't, I think, or if I don't, I think I'll be out of out of integrity. Because sometimes I think when we see things in this multiplicity, there is a danger to not looking at what is so saliently problematic, you know. So
Mm,
hopefully I answered
yeah.
some parts of that
I
question.
think there's a lot to think about, and I'm sure we'll have some questions in a few minutes coming from that. Our third question is around methodology and methods, which again, I think we've already, all these questions kind of overlap in many ways.
Yeah.
I do want to just point out and maybe give a little bit of time if there's something here. In the article that you suggested, The Unsettling Imagined Lands, I think it's in the Oxford Handbook of Methods for Public Scholarship, you really do outline in this piece, I would say kind of a methodological framework that you've come to over the years. And what I really enjoyed in the last part of the chapter are these three actionable, I think is the word you use, methodological turns. And one you've mentioned briefly already, which is giving up your will to know, which also seems like an oxymoron here. But I think the way that you talked about it earlier was really helpful in seeing this notion of giving up our will to know. And then two, imagine your participants and communities as your primary audience. And three, create new methodologies and strategies of inquiry. So I want to make sure we can turn here in a moment to our last question about students, because I know you have a lot to say about how you mentor and work with students. But is there anything else, excuse me, around methodologies and methods, maybe that was written in this particular piece or otherwise that you want to comment on before we shift to that final question?
Yeah, so I think that the notion to abandon methodology, you know, and there's plenty of very seductive pieces that is so sweet to deep deep dive into, and I don't necessarily want to dismiss that because I think there's value in that too. However, I do think that certain times certain disciplines and privileges come into play whether or not you can do those types of work, and I don't want that to be um, understood in such a universality that we should all aspire to doing methodological work without methodology. And that comes from like a question again a mentor asked me when I was going through my dissertation process, and she saw me being very sort of homogeneous in terms of like where I was locating myself, and how I was talking about it in very oppositional discourse. And so she asked me, when you become a methodologist, are you only going to help the people that do the research that you do, or do you plan to help other people? Like, can somebody who's doing a phenomenological research come to you, or is it going to be mini me? All of them, all of their research need to look like yours in some form or another, glorifying you. And I was like, holy crap, I'm turning into an elitist, you know, academic elitist. And I didn't want to, you know, and I always felt like I need to be the bridge, you know, like, so it doesn't matter if a student doesn't want to work on the same thing that I want to work in. I want to make sure that the student, whatever the student's sweet spot is nurtured. Now, I'm going to challenge you, Grant. I'm going to make sure you think through this, think through it multiple ways, and anticipate what resistance you're going to get, be able to defend the work and justify the work. So I'm going to do that. But I want to make sure that the students are nurtured from the places that they need to be in, and do the work that is in alignment with their own onto epistemologies, context, politics, histories, and all of those things. And so some of those markers have been like, I look back on the dissertations people have done and under my mentorship, and I'm just happy that they don't all look alike, you know, they have diversity in them. So now you want me to talk about the three methodological turns? Or
Well, if
would
you
you
want
ask
to
me?
speak briefly, but I also want to make sure that we have some time to talk about students and open up for question and answer. So what would be your preference here?
Let's do 2 more minutes of talking about those turns, and then we'll
Okay,
open up the Q&A. Okay.
sure. Okay, sounds great.
So you know, the will to abandon, the will to sort of abandoning the will to know. I have already talked about it. I don't think you have a right to know, even if you have research purpose questions and consent forms, because it's not your space, it's somebody else's space. They're donating that generously to you or sharing it with you. So from that perspective, if learning about somebody else's lived experience or experiences rather, um, then you have to be sort of in this humble position of accepting what they're gifting you, you know. And then the second part of that was choose the participants as your primary audience. That was one of my unlearning, you know. So when I imagine my participants as my primary audience reading this, and not academic gatekeepers, my writing changed. Granted, that got challenged in reviews, and I just theoretically defended it. That I'm coming from this space of decolonial work, and in this space, I cannot prioritize a Western Anglo audience as my primary audience. So this needs to be resonating with people that look like my participants first. It could, and I think good work will cross boundaries. The good work always crosses boundaries, because if I do culturally situated work, it has an insider validation and legitimization for the people who are cultural insiders. But then if I do, but then other cultural outsiders can create their own entry point, and it begins to do the work of interconnectivity and bridging, just like I was inspired by Linda Thuy Smith and Gloria Anzaldúa. So good work always crosses boundaries, even if it's culturally situated. So prioritizing participants shifts the way I write completely. How I use language, what I write, what I say, shifts that. And then the new methodologies I talked about it. If everything is made up, then we can make up our own stuff too. Like, we don't have to be, all things don't have to go through interviews, focus groups, and observations. There are so many other ways we relate to each other. And so I have a chapter coming up where I'm talking about qualitative data analysis is relationship analysis. The relationship that you have built, it's the analysis of those relationships, and you are deciding as a researcher what is sacred about that relationship that no one needs to know about, because that came through because you were able to build a relationship, and what is acceptable to put it out to the public, and so that changes when you stop looking at participants as data repositories from whom you extract information.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're going to pivot to a Q&A time, but what I'll first do is invite people who have questions to share to find the Q&A button and start populating questions there. And Erin and Viv will moderate. And so if there's some that are similar, they'll try to put them together so we can get through as many as possible. But as people are starting to put questions there, maybe just spend a couple minutes on our kind of fourth question is about advice or suggestions that you have for students. And I know just through social media that you have lots of creative ways that you invite students, not just at your university, but internationally, to mentor them as writers and to help them think about navigating the academy. And so if there's any, I know you've sprinkled some of that throughout our whole conversation today, but if there's anything else that you might comment on that, and then inviting people to start putting questions, Erin and Viv will moderate that in just a few minutes.
Yeah. So I think it's really important. Sometimes people give advice and say, just change advisors if somebody doesn't support your work. But I think it's really important to know not everybody has abundant choices of advisors. People are in different contexts, in different political contexts where some of that option is not possible, So this, for graduate students, if they are in those positions where the choice of advisors are limited and they have to, or serious stuff will happen if they switch advisors, that would be harmful to them, then this would become time to build some self-advocacy skills, because you're going to need that after you go out into the world, and especially if you decide to be an academic after that, self-advocacy skills or advocating for your research or participants or a situation or a cause or an issue is going to be a really valuable skill for you to learn. So I think that that's going to be very important. Now, if you do have advisors who are working and they're not necessarily oppositionally situated to the students' work, but they are situated in ways that they don't understand it, I would say, like, for those faculty members, well, of course the student will have to do self-advocacy, but for those faculty members, it's really important to go on a journey with the students and learn with the student. It's just important to say, like, what, I'm not familiar with it. I've had students come and tell me some stuff and I wasn't familiar. I'm like, I'll learn with you. I'll think with you. You don't have to know everything, but you just have to create the space where you and the student can explore some stuff together. And then if you are someone who are student oriented, then I think you'd have to build a culture around your own space to have this expansive way of thinking about inquiry. So whether that be like just do workshops, bring speakers in, do webinars, and so then when your colleagues don't understand it, they will still understand this other thing exists that they don't get, and people talk with this other thing that they don't get. They may be dismissive of it if they're really hostile to the work, but it may do your student a favor, because then it'll be like, well, she's situating herself in this thing, and it's not limited to the two qual faculty in our college. There's a whole world of people who are talking about this. So I may not be informed about it, but there's a whole discourse around it. And you just have to promote that fact that those discourses exist, and the student is locating themselves in those discourses. And if you're able to, if you're a faculty member, if you're able to publish something with the student, give the student the space to establish the work that they're doing, legitimize it, cite that back into the dissertation to say it's published. We've already published it. It's already went through a round of legitimization. So those are sort of like the things that I thought I haven't said that I will sprinkle in.
Thank you. So I think we do have questions coming in. So I see if Erin or Viv want to start us off and read out the question, and we'll engage in some conversation now.
Okay, I can see one question, and it is how thinking of participants as primary audience, can researchers highlight some challenges existing within a system? For example, a high needs school. As part of the findings of the study, what language would you recommend for reporting such findings?
So I'm not sure what a high needs school exactly means. Is it high needs because they don't have the proper resources, and so they need a lot of resources for the school? It just feels like a very specific language. So I want to make sure I understand that. But I also want to say that when I say think with the participants as your primary audience, the participants are not homogenized or essentialized as one person or one group thinking entity, you know. So I think no matter what work you do, human studies of any kind is going to be complex with tensions anyway. It's just the ethics switches. If you imagine to that you were sharing this research to a room full of people that are your participants, your ethics switches to like, what is your obligation? What is your primary obligation? So it helps you in prioritizing like how you write and what you write about, but it doesn't mean it's tension free. It'll still have tension. So when I think of like folks that are like me who are reading this, I will think of the tensions that those folks might be thinking about, and I will address that as I write, because I don't see them as an essentialized group. So for example, I use the term they see in my per they see framework, but I also know they see is a contested term. So I will put that in there saying it's a contested term. Not everybody identifies with this, even if they are from different South Asian, countries. So I think that it's just that it's not that you anticipate unproblematic acceptance from your participants. You anticipate the tensions and the complicatedness of that too, and speak to it however which way you want to speak to it. It's just the gatekeeping, if you want to think of it that way. Your obligation, ethical obligation to the participants, switches what you want to write about and how you want to write about versus, if you think of like reviewers in a journal who might not be cultural insiders.
That's a great thought. So we had a request to expand on your notions of relationship analysis. And there was a question, how could you suggest that a young researcher use relationship analysis and develop agency?
Yeah. So I think like just the historical structure of research is very transactional, right? So if you are engaging in research and you have other human beings with whom you are engaging in research, what I would say is that build relationships first. Don't do it like 2 weeks before your consent form due to your human subjects ethics board. Build those relationships first, not for the purpose of transaction, but just to build relationships, to have genuine curiosity. So your participant would know that you have some genuine investment before you even think of them as somebody that with whom you want to work. If it's an education space, figure out how you can be in that space. You have to realize that one research that you're doing, whether it be for your dissertation or post-dissertation research, is giving you academic mileage. If it's your dissertation, you're getting a degree, potentially the highest degree on the planet, riding on the back of other people's experiences. you're going to have to think about what is the reciprocity here, and the reciprocity should start before the relationship starts. What do you want to give to this group that's going to give you your career? And that's really important to think about. And that's how you disrupt the structure of research, to think, what do I want to give? Just give, not expect anything back, but just give. Because if it's something you really deeply care about, then you have things to offer to that community as well. So you want to be able to figure that out. And if you can't figure that out, then just be in relationship to understand how people exist in these spaces, doing these things, experiencing whatever they're experiencing, before you even begin to think about a research purpose and questions. It's kind of practice based, practice being in community with folks before you figure out what inquiry needs to look like in that space. And then when you develop the inquiry, definitely then develop the inquiry that is relational. So all of the ways that in which you're going to collect data needs to be thought of as something that deepens this relationship that you have built and offers reciprocity for what they're offering you. And that reciprocity could be many different things. That reciprocity could be being a source of support, being somebody to listen to the participant, or doing something that you can do that is reasonable to do for that community. It can look so many different ways, but that's something you want to think about. And the ways in which you build those relationships could look really different. You could be cooking together because that's what makes sense, and you could be cooking together and sitting around a kitchen table talking. You could be looking at pictures from their family albums and talking about certain things that hold them to certain memories. So we don't have to only go for the one way, sort of limited ways in which some of the dominant discourse has been set up. Like you have in-depth semi-structured questions, and you have 5 of them, and then you ask them, and then you have probes. You don't have to. If it makes sense for you to do that, you can, but you don't have to. Like, for example, I had a student who wanted to work with older Black women and their understanding of spirituality and sexuality through informal learning contexts. But when she first started, she wanted to, and I had gotten her later, like she didn't come through my classes, so I had gotten her later. So when she first started, she started thinking about it in terms of putting these women in a focus group in a conference room at the university. But these women don't interact that way naturally. They're not going to come out and say things that are generous and generative. They're going to feel like this is a performance and I'm going to perform for this in the sterile cold space of a university conference room. That's not how they will interact. So I had to ask her, what would you do if this wasn't an academic work? If this, like, my exact language was, how would you actually want to know this if you didn't feel like academic guns are pointed at you? And that academic guns pointed at you is a real thing for folks that are minoritized in multiple different ways. And that's when she says, well, I would just go to their house. I would just hang out with them. I would just do things like cook with them and just sit around the kitchen table and talk. And then we're publishing now, she created a framework that's informed by Black feminist thought and narrative inquiry and certain ways of understanding what has happened. And of course, some of this we have to also understand in the context of research and dissertation work. It gets compromised some because you have 4 committee members and a few are not as open and flexible, and you still want to look out for the student's best interest. So it's not as open as you would want it to be, but it creates a pathway that can later be expanded. So I think that the relationship building part of it, and then when you're analyzing the data, you analyze it based on the richness of the relationship. The take data that you're getting it because you developed a rich relationship. Is directly related, so when you're analyzing the data, it can't be like they said this and you move yourself out of it. You are in it, and your interaction with that person generated whatever information it generated. So it needs to be entangled and not take a separate researcher stance that you're just reporting information that was shared.
Thanks, Kakali, for that. maybe we could move on to the question about coding, since you've just been talking about analyzing data. So I think that you have said that coding is not a dirty word.
Mm.
And how do you balance this sort of post-qualitative critique of coding with your stance on it?
I love when people come and read other stuff that I did not suggest and then ask me a question. Thank you, Nalini, for that. So if you read the 3 papers that I did suggest, in one of them I said that I put myself in exile from post-qual because I don't understand post-qual. I don't know what post-qual is. Betty even said post-qual is not a thing, but it's a thing. So that confused me all sorts of ways. I'm like, maybe Betty can explain to me what post-qual is, but I don't know what post-qual is, or if the verb goes with post-qual. It probably doesn't, because it fixes post-qual to something and it just doesn't want to be fixed to anything, but it fixes itself to a label. So I'm very confused about it, and I have written about it in exile from post-qual because I've had this front row seat. I had this front row seat where Betty and Patty were talking about it. And then we had these paradigm charts. And then we had a chart outside of the last column, which was deconstructivism at that time, with the post and question mark, question mark, question mark. I still have that. Patty emailed it to me. I have that. And then it became post-qual a few years after I graduated. But I was still able to do the work I was doing without the label of post-qual. So I was like, why do I need this label? I'm doing this work. Just like how Betty is sort of saying like, look, qual is made up. So I'm making up post-qual too, because I'm in post-critique of qual, and I'm like, well, qual is made up, post-qual is made up. And I didn't need the post-qual label to think theoretically, onto-epistemologically, and then figure out what stems from that, because that was, I've taken all of Betty's classes, so I was all very influenced by that way of thinking. But I needed to situate and ground myself culturally too, and so that became another layer of my journey and thought process along the years. I don't think coding is inherently bad. I think that there are certain projects that require coding. I think people who do reductive coding to like some very sterile way of thinking about it, they don't have theoretical depth, and that's why. So bad research is bad research. You do bad research because you're not thinking deeply. So if you think superficially, it doesn't matter if you do coding or writing or narrative or phenomenology, it's just still going to be bad research. So I think that coding is not a dirty word. I think we structure things. It depends on how we think about coding. We can think about coding as something that's reductive with one label, but there are as many ways of coding as there are coders. I don't necessarily do traditional coding. It just isn't something I do because it's not the way I think. But if I need to make lists and organize thoughts and stuff into just different issues that I'm thinking about, some people could say that's coding, except my semantic unit of meaning is like 3 pages on which I'm writing some more about it, whereas it's more traditional use of coding where the semantic unit is like a phrase or a few words. Mine is usually not that, but I would read transcripts and pause when I have some thoughts come up, and I would just write around that, or if there's a turn in the narrative, I would sit and think about the narrative, think about what arises for me in that, how I think through this with different things that are in my head, and I would do that. And somebody could say that's coding too, except now I have this very long script that I am using as my sort of catalyst to think with, except it's not like 3 words or 5 words. So I think we chunk information. I think we have to. How do we process information if we don't chunk? Chunking information doesn't mean that we don't connect it to other pieces of information. I just think that it's really important to know what drives the thinking. What's the theoretical drive, philosophical drive? And then if you need to chunk information to dig deep into it, then deep into when people do like a Foucauldian power knowledge analysis, they're still thinking with Foucault's constructs of those ideas. So there is a theoretical layering that is getting layered into different pieces of the information. It's probably not it's probably not accurate to say like you can do like a one-on-one application of theory to certain things. Like if you can really take like decolonial and say this one thing is this one thing. You cannot probably do that kind of positivist linkage, but you probably can do the implications of it, the interconnectivity of it, the entanglement of it, the tensions of it, using these types of thinking. So to me, those are still structures. Those are still some structures that are messy and that are open-ended, but they're still structures. So I think that coding's not a dirty word. I just don't do the kind of coding that that people do with words and phrases. But I mean, I see value in it. There's lots of value in it for lots of people that need to do that kind of work. It's just not where I land, but I don't shade it either.
Do you have recommendations either for those reading work or for students that you're encouraging to perform the work in establishing that rigor or discerning that level of rigor in the relationship, in the conducting of research?
So you mean rigor for doing coding analysis by coding, or rigor for qualitative research and broadly?
Broadly.
I think it's really important to figure out what is important for the community, like whatever the community that you're working with. It's really important to figure out what is important for the community. So before you even go to ethical benchmarking, there has to be some sort of like information gathering from the community to say like what is right for this community, what would this community value. And then if you find work, that theoretical work, methodological work, that philosophical work that have spoken about those things, then you would add to it and make a justification for it. There are some pieces that are out there if you want like established pieces, mileage varies on how people pick these up. People pick this up with completely, dismissing it, or some people like value it really highly. Mileage varies, but AERA came up with an humanities oriented educational research criteria, and it's pretty open-ended. Eisner and Barone has some criteria for open-ended creative arts-based research. Susan Finley has some criteria for justification and justice-oriented arts-based research. And then Sarah Tracy did this other piece as well from Qualitative Inquiry in 2010, which got different traction. Some people loved it, some people challenged it, but it still has certain matrices with which you can think. Sometimes what happens is if you can like put things in pictures and stuff in committee, even if it's like open-ended for you, but it creates certain intelligibility, sometimes that's a strategic move to make. You can write open-ended later, but for that moment it's a strategic move, and you can make that or resist it. It's up to you how you want to do it. So I had a student who was doing this beautiful arts-based stuff informed by my work, and she had given her participants bags, and they did bag portrait of front and back of the bag, how they show up in the world and what they hide. And these are like people who are graphic designers, artists, creative folks, but they have learning disabilities. So they're really saying, and inside the bag they put paraphernalias of their key life milestones, and so it generated very rich narratives. And I gave her a very I took this mixed medium art making classes, so I gave her all the ways I make mixed medium art, and we came up with a way of doing this work with mixed medium art making. So all of this is, you can realize how, if the rest of the committee members are traditional, they have no intelligibility towards this, because like they're barely at qual, let alone at this mixed medium art analysis of bag portraits, So basically she then ended up creating a matrix of Eisner and Barone, Sarah Tracy's, AERA Humanities, and color coded like what ideas like were overlapping and what were unique, and so then she said, my work goes into these parts of this matrix. So it's aligned with Eisner and Barone this way, Sarah Tracy this way, AER Humanities this way, and generated a conversation based on that. And that created some intelligibility. Now you can critique it. Everything can be critiqued. You can critique it. You can say it held, unstable structure stable. Yeah, it did. But whenever you write something in paper, you're creating some stability, and you can unstabilize it.
We're getting close to our time, but maybe we can do one last question. I don't know, Viv, if you would like to ask the one about threshold traveling, and then maybe we'll have that be our last one, and then we'll give some announcements and wrap up for today.
Yeah, thanks. This is also something I'm interested in, because you were talking about the gap in the literature and how to do that differently. So how do you suggest a young researcher uses threshold traveling to explore a gap?
Sure. So if I look at my own traditions, my cultural traditions, right? When we come into new knowledge, we acknowledge the elders that came through, and we receive knowledge from the elders. So we can reimagine literature review as receiving knowledge from academic, intellectual predecessors. We can be in dialogue with them, agreement, disagreement, whatever, but we acknowledge the work that those who went before us did, and then draw from it the inspiration for our work and add to the conversation, versus saying like nobody was here to think the way I did. But we can take it remarkably, so we can write literature reviews as journeys. We can write literature reviews as I traveled into these spaces, this created these insights, and then I traveled into this other spaces and this created insights. And then I came here and I was inspired by these folks to ask this question. So not to say like nobody else asked before me, but it's an acknowledgement of what inspired you and how you journeyed through reading those things and where you landed as a result of it. It's more reflexive than situating yourself in ways where you're the sharpest intellectual thinker of the current moment who can figure out this amazing gap, and then it also has, a sense of paying homage and gratitude to academic predecessors who came before you, even if some of their work is not something you would line up with, but maybe it made you think something, maybe it became generative for you, and for that they deserve credit. And so I approach it that way. So in my Pardesi work, that's how I set it up. That's how I set up my reading of the literature. So it's a narrative about your reading and acknowledging elders, academic elders or academic predecessors.
Well, thank you so much. I hate that we're at time because I would love to continue a conversation. But like I said earlier, I have seen you present at conferences and read your work, and this was really the first time to have a dialogue. And I hope it's the first of many to come one day when we're able to be in spaces, maybe in person at conferences and things like that. So thank you just for your honesty. I think your writing shows these narratives, these journeys that you just were talking about, and how you come to be in your thinking now and all the things that influence that. And I just appreciate that transparency and how you write.